morning. Thank you for coming out in this less than lovely weather. I was actually surprised to see so many of you here. As Eve mentioned, I was a high school teacher for a decade, and then when I had uh, my child, who was diagnosed with autism, um, I thought that I wasn't being um, told everything that I could access. Um, Teachers, the big secret is, in our teacher training programs, we don't learn this stuff. Um, so I was sort of relying on the school to tell me things, and it wasn't, they didn't want to necessarily tell everything because there's a financial disincentive in doing so. Um, so I started on my journey. I took classes, became a special education advocate, did that for 17 years. And at this point, I am back in school. Long in the tooth for that, but back in school and finishing up a master's in disability services in higher education. So for those of you who have kids embarking on college and you have any questions, you can ask me afterwards. But we'll start with the nuts and bolts of the special education process. And as Eve said, if anything I'm saying is unclear, please raise your hand, because I've been out of practice. I mean, I haven't done an in-person presentation in quite some time. So it's good to have that feedback, because that was one of my concerns about doing these things online, because you have no idea whether things are falling flat. Are they understood? You're just sort of speaking out into the ether. So we will begin. Like I said, any questions? I'm supposed to use this thing. This isn't my computer, and I never use a mouse. I use the touchpad. Okay. All righty. So I think it's important to understand the findings and the purposes of the law to really know what it's all about. Why do we have this law? And as a parent looking for services for your child with a disability, it's important to understand what this law is all about, so that you know if you are on solid ground with the proposals that you make to your team. So the findings, and there are many findings, but I love this language. It says disability is a natural part of the human experience and in no way diminishes the right of individuals to participate in or contribute to society. Improving educational results for children with disabilities is an essential element of our national policy of ensuring equality of opportunity, full participation, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency for individuals with disabilities. Other findings that I didn't put here. Students have been impeded for the past 30 years, when this was written in 2004, by the low expectations of teachers and insufficient focus on applying replicable, research-based, or what we would today call evidence-based, methods in teaching. Nowhere is this more prevalent or more acutely felt than in reading. We have a nation, really, a generation of kids who have not been taught to read using appropriate methodologies. And Connecticut has used the Lucy Calkins program. She was at Columbia Teachers College. She is no longer. Columbia Teachers College has quietly shuttered the program, but our kids have felt that. They do not know how to sound out words. It is not something that they are taught. Um, Educational systems across the United States have been sold a bill of goods. And unfortunately, it is our children who feel that pinch. So you should know that part of the findings of this law, and this is the book, this is my better copy. I'm less embarrassed to show this one than my other one, but this is Pete Wright's rights law. And basically what he has done is he has put the statute and the regulations in one book for IDEA. And you can see it's a pretty hefty book, and that's where the statutes and regs are. I'll leave it here if anyone wants to take a look. But it's important for you to understand what the findings are so that you know, are you on solid ground? The other thing that they have said is that having high expectations of students and students having access to the general ed curriculum adds to their success. So just be mindful of that when a school district asks you, they'll say, we'll give you extra reading help, but we'll take them out of science. We'll take them out of social studies. Maybe they won't go to art, but art is like their raison d'etre. Like this is what they come to school for. And they are being told, no, we're going to do this here. Well, what the law says is that we need to keep them in the general education curriculum. So just be aware of that when that is, your choice. It shouldn't be a choice. We have something in the law that allows for extended school year and extended school day. If the law says we think it takes 6 hours and 35 minutes a day, 5 days a week, 180 days a year, for your kids to get through the general education, typical kids, then it should necessarily follow that for kids who may be developmentally behind or struggling with a concept or the pacing needs to be slower, that it should necessarily take more time. And that could include extended school day or extended school year. The purpose of this law is to ensure that all children with disabilities have available to them a free, appropriate public education, FAPE, that emphasizes special education and related services to meet their unique needs and prepare them for further education. Further education. That means we have to look at career and technical education, vocational education, college, university. There is something beyond the K-12 arena. That is what this law is saying. So when you say, I need you to help me have him work on his Common App, and that can be a special education goal, absolutely. And they'll say, oh, no, that's for the guidance counselor. No, it could be specialized instruction because your child needs more time with it. And that is an absolutely valid request to make because further education is part of the purpose. The other purposes are employment and independent living. I think having kids work over the summer is a really important thing to learn. And schools will, not want to have that piece in a transition program, but it is really important. And we have to realize that we learned a lot when we took that job at McDonald's. I never took a job at McDonald's because I thought it was beyond my capabilities. So I did other things like anything, waitressing. I couldn't do that either because I would just, spill the food on people. Truly beyond my capabilities. But, I worked in a bakery, I worked at Macy's, I worked, here, there, and everywhere. We had these summertime jobs and after-school jobs. You learn a lot of really terrific soft skills. You learn to negotiate with a boss. You learn to show up on time. you know, it's great to get that first paycheck, and then you look at it and say, who the heck is FICA and why are they taking 12%? You learn a lot of really important things. I think not having our kids do those kinds of opportunities puts them at a severe disadvantage. The first time they are looking for a job shouldn't be that all-important, you know, launch of a career. It really shouldn't, because the stakes are just too high. Get your kid a job, a low-stakes job. Have the school help you with it if you can't find something. And I just think they will learn so much. Okay, next. IDEA has several principles. The first principle is FAPE, free, appropriate public education. Free means at no cost to the parent. So that's very important. It doesn't mean that, you know, if somebody gives the school a grant, that the school has to then, you know, pay for it or something. If they are able to secure you something for free, as long as you're not paying for it, that's important. Appropriate was never defined or identified. It was just sort of left very vague for a very long time until we had the Andrew F. case. And Andrew F. was a boy with significant autism, and it was decided in, I think it was the Ninth Circuit. Neil Gorsuch, before he was a justice, actually wrote the decision, and then it was brought up to the Supreme Court. It was granted cert, went to the Supreme Court, appealed to the Supreme Court, and the day that he took his job at the Supreme Court released their decision overturning his. So I just love that little irony, because he basically said, you know, that this boy was receiving an appropriate education, and the parents had pulled this child so that he would have a private to a private placement. And Neil Gorsuch said, no, you know, they didn't, you know, the child didn't warrant that. And the Supreme Court overturned him in a decision that was 8-0. At this point, Justice Scalia had died. And so there were only 8 justices. But when you think about like just how partisan this country has been, to have a decision that's 8-0 sort of shows like this was a really bad decision, Neil, that you penned, and they were going to let you know about that. So appropriate is now defined as a program that is sufficiently robust to enable the student to make progress in light of his or her circumstances. Now, this is the tricky part. In light of his or her circumstances. I mean, it's better than nothing. Before we had nothing, and what happened was that the Second Circuit, where we are, like half of the country said, it means meaningful progress. That wasn't where Connecticut was. Connecticut's in the Second Circuit, and Connecticut, our circuit, said it means more than minimal progress. Just a hair above minimal progress, and that's appropriate. Kids, simply by being awake, make more than minimal progress. I mean, you know, they're taking in information, their brains are growing. They are making appropriate progress whether we do anything or not, you know, or more than minimal progress, I should say. The appropriate means we have to deliver, you know, an education that actually, you know, focuses that brain power on something. So that was where, you know, the country was. One side said meaningful, the other side, just a smidge over minimal, and we're good. And what the Andrew F. Case decided was appropriate is neither. It's neither one of those. And what it is that you have to have a program robust enough to enable the student to make meaningful progress in light of his or her circumstances. And you should understand that that's a proxy for IQ. So, one of the things that I have noticed is that maybe the IQ score that you may receive from a school district is not accurate. Because if we have a lower IQ score, then the amount of expected progress would be lower. That's the child's circumstances. If we have a higher IQ, we expect more progress. So that, just be mindful of that. You want to make sure that when IQ testing is administered to your student, to your child, that it is done according to protocol and, everything is the way it should be, so that we're not suppressing an IQ, because then less is expected in terms of progress. So that's just one. Yes. I have often seen that, but what you have to understand is people aren't coming to me because everything is going well. People come to me because something was messed up somehow, some way. So I probably have a very skewed view of what is actually happening there. When I do see a good evaluation from a school district, I am thrilled. I think a lot of school districts, and this is, I believe, I do not know, it has not been confirmed, but I think that school districts are limited in what they are allowed to put there. I have seen evidence of that for 2 different school districts, but we have 220 in our state. So 169 public schools, and the rest are charter schools or magnet schools. They're their own LEA, their own local educational administration. So it's hard to extrapolate from those 2 teacher handbooks that I've read personally to say that is what is happening statewide. But it is borne out by a lot of what I've read. When you get a private evaluation, the acronym that I learned was SOAP. There's a subjective piece, there's an objective piece, there's analysis, and then there's a plan. The subjective piece. Little Mary came in, she was well dressed. She appeared her stated age. She left her mother willingly and sat down ready to test. That's, fairly subjective. The objective piece is the testing results, and the analysis is the A of SOAP. I don't see any analysis in a district test. What I see is the S and the O. I don't see the A and the P. I don't see a plan. I don't see any recommendations. What I see is these results will be presented at the PPT, and the PPT will decide. Well, I actually need the speech and language pathologist to give me speech and language pathology recommendations. The OT certainly shouldn't weigh in on that. What does the OT know about SLP? Or any of that. Like, we need the experts to weigh in, and then yes, as a team, we can decide. That being said, a neuropsych is incredibly expensive, and I also know that the districts are getting very, very challenging in terms of giving you the right to an IEE. One of the things that I would do is I would find studies. Yale does a lot of studies, NYU does a lot of studies out of their child study programs. They will do research, and you can look up on their websites and find what research studies they're doing. And generally, as a a consequence of being in the study, what they want to do is they want to take your child's IQ. They want, if it's a study, we did one on from the Haskins lab, which is now connected to Yale. They used to be separate, and we got a full speech and language evaluation before they implemented an intervention, a new intervention method that they were trying. They wanted to see, does it work? A lot of times they will ask for, somebody who is diagnosed with autism or somebody with a diagnosis of dyslexia. Other times you will see that they want typical children as well as disabled children, so that they have their, what is the word? Cheryl, help me. What do you call the person who, your control? Thank you. The word finding. That's Cheryl Knapp, by the way, in the back, and she is an OG provider, an Orton Gillingham provider. And so if you have any reading questions, you go to her. The public education piece is next. Did that help, like, find, another way of getting evaluations? So you will get an evaluation as part of the research protocol. And you can present those evaluations to the district, and a lot of times, that's a something that will be in either conflict, or it will agree with what the school district has found. So it's just good for you to know. The public education piece of FAPE is that it's supposed to happen in the public school, but it may not. There was a case, the Carter case, and there's an illustration on that Wright's Law book, which is down there if anyone wants to take a look. But the illustration is Pete Wright presenting the Carter case in front of the Supreme Court, and that was the case that allowed parents to seek an outplacement, a private placement, when the school district has shown like they're just unable to educate your child. So yes, the presumption is that it happens in the public school, but at least the Carter case says, you know what, if they can't do it, the child shouldn't suffer for the district's inability to do so. They don't have the expertise, they don't have the resources, they don't have the physical space to have smaller classes, whatever the reason. Or it could also be that the child could be a danger to himself or others, or herself and others. I don't know that I would want a fire starter in my child's class, or somebody who has shown predatory behavior. It's better for that child to be outplaced and to get the very, very specific help and intervention that they need. A question? Yes, yes. So I will get to, so the question was, is there a way to know that the testing is accurate or not? I get to that a little bit later on, so I will talk about that. But just in general, you know your child. And if it sounds like your child, great. I find a lot of times it may sound like your child, it's just not expansive enough. Like, it's not comprehensive. And maybe if they were looking at reading, they looked very narrowly at comprehension. And that is one of the strands of reading, but there are a lot of other things that go into reading. And, did they test for decoding when you suspected that the child had a dyslexia, perhaps, having difficulty sounding out the words? Did they actually do a test of that? That's what I find a lot of the time, that they're not sort of targeting what needs to be targeted. And a lot of times even the tests aren't that great. I mean, if anyone can point out a writing test that doesn't, skew well beyond what I would expect, a child to be able to do, it tends to inflate their writing capabilities. The TOWEL is the one I'm thinking of, the test of written language. It really inflates a child's score, and you think, well, he's average or she's average. And, I'm here to tell you that's not average. Like if you're not able to, have noun-verb agreement, or, the vocabulary is quite sparse, or simple. I used to say to my son, I need more, I need more Wordsworth and less Hemingway, because he would just write like, the shortest little essay, the shortest little paragraph, what he thought he could get away with. And I was like, you need to embellish. And so, like Hemingway, like we all read The Old Man and the Sea. We all read Hemingway when we had to read a book in high school, because it was like, oh, that's like 90 pages. I can read that, no War and Peace for me. So we'd all gravitate towards Hemingway. But I would say to my son, like, hey, less Hemingway, more Wordsworth. You haven't really fleshed out the argument or whatever. Yeah. No. That is, so the Connecticut General Statute, so there's federal law. The federal law doesn't actually say anything about when tests can be provided to the parents. Under our law, Connecticut state law, which has to at least agree with the federal law, it can go above, it cannot go below. So in Connecticut, you may ask for the evaluations for the initial evaluation 3 days in advance. The school district will have to provide that to you 3 days in advance. While the law is only for the initial evaluation, it has just become practice that they give it to you for every evaluation. So I would certainly, just ask for it in advance. And that is something, and I'll get to that, there's a slide that I talk about what you should be asking for prior to a PPT meeting so that you're prepared. That is certainly within your rights. Conversely, if the law says 3 days and the school district then has a policy that any private evaluations need to be given to us 2 weeks in advance or 5 days in advance, I'd say, you as educators, you should be able to read this, this evaluation that I am providing to you in 3 days if you expect me to read everything in 3 days as a non-educator. Fair is fair. You don't have to be a total stickler about it. If you have it 5 days in advance, give it to them 5 days in advance. But if it's a question of, the evaluator didn't get it to you in time, and but there are 3 days, they should be able to review that and talk about that in the PPT meeting. Okay, next, I have BASE written down there. A lot of times people think of FAPE and they think of education as academics, solely academics. That's a very narrow view. When we think about what can be on an IEP and what an education consists of, think about the acronym BASE: behavior, academics, social, emotional. You can also think about all of the related services, the speech and language, the OT, the PT, the counseling, the social work services, transition services, travel training, etc. All of those things are part of education. The day starts the minute your child gets on the bus. And whatever happens on the bus, if he's struggling on the bus, then that's part of his IEP. If he's on the cafeteria line and he can't wait, we've got to build that into, as a goal or an objective. Everything that happens during the day and even after in extracurricular activities, that's part of his plan or her plan. Don't take that narrow view of just academics. It's the soft skills that occur during the day and the things that help a child to have a sense of welcome and a feeling of belonging. That's really important to your educational experience. If you feel like you don't belong, if you don't have any friends, I mean, having to get up every day and go somewhere where you don't feel like you're welcomed, where you don't belong, where you're just existing or merely tolerated, that's not fun. And our children know that they've got to do this at least until the 12th grade. And that's a miserable experience. So work on, that sense of belonging, and try to come up with goals and objectives and changes in policies and procedures to allow that to happen. Because everyone's, entitled to a friend. It just makes it so much, I mean, it's not in law, but, who would deny a kid that? So it shouldn't be such a miserable, horrendous experience to have to go to school, because they know that they're going to have to keep doing this for many, many years to come. So try to make it as pleasant as it can be. LRE is least restrictive environment. That refers to the setting where your child has his or her services or his program. Congress did not intend for students to be necessarily educated in the general ed. If they thought that all children should be educated in the general education, they would have put, you are entitled to FAPE in the general education. But they come up with this construct, this least restrictive environment. And what this means is that there needs to be a continuum of placements. And it goes from the least restrictive, which is a general ed classroom, to the most restrictive, which is home. Prior to home is prison. Prison is considered less restrictive than being home because at least you're with your buds. In prison, you're with some peers. At home, it's the mommy show or the daddy show, and you don't have same age peers. You may have siblings, but you don't have same age peers outside of your family. And that's very restrictive. That's what they're talking about when they're talking about the environment. It also refers to access to the general education curriculum. So you want the setting to be as least restrictive as possible, as unrestricted as possible, but that also includes the general ed curriculum. That should be what we're all sort of striving for, so that we do have those high expectations, they do have exposure. Kids can surprise us. They can learn. That is something like, do you believe my child can learn? And if you don't, then maybe I don't want you as my teacher. Because we should have that presumption that everyone is educable. So the least restrictive environment in Connecticut, we generally default to, just a few things. We've got the classroom and we've got the resource room. And a lot of kids don't like being pulled into a resource room because they feel like they're missing out. It's FOMO, right? That they're missing out, and the kids who perhaps need consistency and predictability are the ones who are, sort of upended. Now you'll go here and you'll be taught by this person. And it's a lot of movement. It's a lot of disruption. Our kids, some kids may not transition very well in between, settings and people and what have you. So I think that, Connecticut doesn't have a robust continuum, if you will. And I'm certainly not holding up New York public schools as the paradigm, but at least in the New York system, you'll have levels of classrooms. So you'll have like the 12-1-1 or the 8-2-1, which, refers to like, 8 students, 2 paras, 1 teacher. They'll have all these configurations. We don't have that in Connecticut. We seem to be sort of guided by Yankee thrift, and it's like you've got the inclusion classroom, if you will, and then you've got a resource room. And the resource room, to my mind, seems like a really difficult place to be if you are the special education teacher, because the scheduling of who is in the resource room at any given time isn't based on the profile of the child. It's based on the administrative convenience of the school. That, this kid happens to be in math at this time and he's in the 4th grade, and so he goes to the resource room. At the same time, in the 1st grade, there's a kid who has issues with reading, and then that kid goes into the resource room at that same time. So to me, it is almost like this untenable position that we put special education teachers in, asking them to do the impossible, manage this kid's program and that kid's program. So what do I assume happens? Triage. The squeaky wheel. Whoever is most behaviorally challenging, that kid gets the attention. And if your kid is an internalizer, meaning, just anxious and, sort of they blame everything on themselves, it's all my fault. Those kids tend to just sort of sit quietly. They may not be learning anything, but they're sitting quietly. So they fall through the cracks. That's my cynical view. Know that it is cynical, but that's what I think occurs. Parental participation is really, really important. This is a principle of IDEA. Parents are listed, when you read the statute and the regs, parents are listed as first on the team. It's parent and general ed teacher and special education teacher and administrator, et cetera. But parents are always listed first. And parents are, the thought of, working collaboratively with parents is interwoven throughout the statute. And it's mentioned a lot that they want parents to be consulted. They believe in the findings. It says that when parents are consulted and, respected, they don't use that word, but when you work collaboratively with parents, the achievement of children improves. Appropriate evaluation is another tenet or principle of IDEA, and so it needs to be sufficiently comprehensive. And so when you're in that evaluation meeting where they're going to be discussing either the initial eval or the triennial, or if you just bring up, we shouldn't wait 3 years. My kid grows an awful lot in a year's time. You can ask for them to evaluate in a year. But you want to look at, cognition. You want to look at achievement. And achievement is, reading and writing and math. And not just the Wyatt or the Woodcock-Johnson tests of achievement, which, might have like 21 subtests that are, 3 minutes long. There's, not a whole lot of depth, not a whole lot of sensitivity. These are very broad strokes. It's like when you go to your doctor and you get your CBC, the complete blood count, and something may seem a little off, and then it's like, you're going for more tests and more tests. But a lot of times they will look at the Wyatt, which is, the Wechsler individual achievement tests. We do a lot of acronyms, so please just raise your hand if I use an acronym, and it'll remind me to give you the actual name. So the Wyatt is an achievement test. It's very broad, and it's just not sensitive enough to determine whether or not a kid has a reading disability. So just because your kid even does well on a Wyatt in reading, it may not mean that he's okay with reading. These are very short passages, very short tests. They're just not, yes, go ahead, Cheryl. Yeah. Right. Right. So when you have a test that says something like from 6 to 90, you know, that's a pretty wide range. And, it is definitely going to, skew the results of, what the expectations are for kids. So it is really important to not stop at a Wyatt. I would ask for more. If reading is your issue, I would ask for more testing. I would ask for vocabulary. I would want to know, is my kid just not understanding what he's reading because he doesn't know the words that he's reading? Or is it a decoding issue? Or is it a fluency issue? Does he not read quickly enough to actually comprehend what he's reading? He reads in such a slow and labored way. He is spending so much time, so much of his cognition is being focused on how to decode the words, that he thinks his job is to decode and not to glean a message from what he's reading, because decoding is so effortful. It has to be automatic. It has to be fluent. I know there are times when you see the ticker go by when you're watching a news program. Well, there's one channel, and I can't remember which one, but it's so slow that when I read it, by the time I get to the end, I've forgotten what was at the beginning because it's just too slow for me. Like I can't. It's too effortful for me to remember. And that's another thing about reading. You've got to keep a certain amount of the sentence in your working memory to know what the message is. So if you've got poor working memory, but you've got good decoding, it doesn't matter. Because you're not it's like, think about when we go into the kitchen. It's like, I came into the kitchen for a reason. Why am I here? The working memory, we've lost it. We've lost the plot. And then you sit there and you're like, I came in here. What was it for? What was it for? You leave and then you remember, right? But so that's what, like, some kids with poor working memory, they're reading it, they're decoding it, but they're not gleaning the message. They're not understanding it. And the point of reading isn't to decode accurately. That is certainly important, but that's not the point. The point is to learn something, to read and understand what you're reading. So, you would want testing that looks at a variety of different things for a comprehensive reading eval. And you'd want to look at spelling, because if you really know how to decode, then if you've truly internalized phonics and phonemic awareness and phonological memory, if you've got all of that intact, then you're probably a good speller. Not always, but I think it's much harder to generate than it is to take it apart, right? It's so much harder. Like, I can take apart a lot of things. Putting it back together, a little harder. And that's what spelling is. You're putting it back together. So that's generally a good sign that your kid is a good reader, or at least has good orthographic memory, which is good for reading. If you can remember the patterns, the orthography of the way words are spelled, then you're in pretty good shape. Cheryl, please weigh in. Am I wrong there, or is that okay? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, especially for the younger kids. I mean, if we're just asking them to do single syllables and blends, we can do cat, we can do chat, but when you say onomatopoeia, spell that, that may take a little more, out of somebody to understand those, spelling rules, the Greek rules or whatever. That was Greek, right? Onomatopoeia? I think it's Greek in origin. Anyway. The next piece is an individual education plan. Now we have a new IEP, but when we had the old IEP, the frontline, it was the drop-down menu IEP, right? I mean, it wasn't individualized, really. They had a thing to choose from, a series of goals and objectives to choose from. It shouldn't be cookie cutter. It really should be designed for your child. And the last thing that I'm going to talk about is procedural safeguards. These are the procedural safeguards. It's now something like 40 pages. When Eve, Cheryl, and I started out, we received a trifold. The font was probably a 6-point font. I mean, I can't read a 14-point font at this point. Like my arms just aren't long enough anymore. 6-point font, trifold, that they would Xerox over and over again to the point where it was so blurry you couldn't read it. Somebody sent it to the feds, and the feds gave Connecticut what for? Connecticut had to redo the procedural safeguards. I think it was sent back 4 times. The feds kept saying, it's still not good enough. It's still not good. You're using way too much legalese. Parents aren't going to understand it. Well, now it's 40 pages. So while it may not use as much legalese, it's certainly a little lengthy. But, try to get through it. Try to, understand what you are entitled to. That's important. Let me see if there's anything else I should mention. Okay, you want to know them. I'll give you a funny story. I was in a PPT once, and they gave us the procedural safeguards. It was the trifold. And they said, do you need these explained to you? And we were like, no, we're good. We're good. And okay, because we're here if you need us to explain them to you. All right. So as the meeting went on, I said, well, we would like an IEE and an independent educational evaluation at public expense. That's the acronym IEE. That's what that means. And the team looked at me and said, what's that? And I said, that would be number 1A on the procedural safeguards. You just tried to tell my client, like, do you have any questions about it? So maybe we can talk to you about what the procedural safeguards actually entail. So know what they are. You are entitled to an independent educational evaluation at public expense if you disagree with the evaluation that the school has done. If it doesn't seem right, they may ask you why. You don't have to tell them. Just say, it doesn't sound like my child. Beyond that, because you don't want to give them the opportunity necessarily to cure the defect in it prior to getting it, because they'll say, oh, no, we can just do X. Or if they were deciding to take you to due process, well, all you told me was wrong with it was this. So don't tell them what's wrong with it. Just say, just doesn't sound like my child. I don't know. Really doesn't make sense to me. I'm confused. And leave it at that, so that you're not sort of talking your way out of the IEE that you want. All righty. Let's see. A thing about least restrictive environment. Your child should not be removed from the general education class if all the child needs is supplementary aids and services. So if you think your child would be fine if there was a behaviorist in the class, or an RBT, a registered behavior technician or registered behavior therapist, or an aide, or if your child had some sort of assistive technology that would help learn whatever it is, if you think that, and they are removing your child, again, for their administrative convenience, to a resource room where there may be as many as 10 kids with 10 different plans, there's no cohort, I would say I would ask for that supplementary aid and service before they insist upon moving your child, if you think that that would be beneficial. If the only reason why they're moving them is for the want of an aid, then say, I want the aid. Does that make sense? Yeah. So the question is, if you have the parent wanted a behavior therapist in the classroom with the child and the school refused, I would ask for the FBA, the functional behavior assessment, and I would ask for a BIP, a behavior intervention plan. Those are the things that I would be asking for. I would want there to be some sort of communication between you and the school daily, and it shouldn't be burdensome to the teacher. The teacher should not have to write out this long narrative. What I would do, the stuff that I wanted to know, I would create a checklist, and I even gave them a clipboard, and I printed a number of these, these forms that I created, and it would be like, he played with so-and-so on the recess playground. And then I had every kid's initial. And so I wanted to know, like, was he sort of gravitating towards, certain kids? So I knew, like, oh, well, I can invite them over for a play date. Or I would say, what was different about today? And that, to me, was more important than anything, because for me, my kid wanted that sameness, wanted that predictability. One time he came home and he was so angry because we had cupcakes, and I was like, oh, tell me about it. We had cupcakes today, and he was angry, and because it was a disruption to the schedule. And it was so-and-so's birthday, and we had to sing happy birthday. Well, he didn't like when people sang off key. He certainly let me know that. No, mommy, no, don't sing. And I would oblige. But that would be something that could, turn him off. And it turned out the reason why he was mad is because it cut short science by 5 minutes. And he wanted science class. So even things that a teacher wouldn't think would be a bad thing. I mean, I would have been like, cupcakes, hooray, we're getting cupcakes. He didn't view it that way. So what was different about today? That's when you find out the teacher was out for a PPT meeting that lasted 2 hours, and there was a sub, and the sub didn't know who he was, and the sub was yelling at him for being difficult. That you get that kind of information when you do it. I would only have like 1 or 2 things that required a sentence, but was he independent in the lunchroom? Was he independent in hanging up his all of his stuff, putting his backpack away? Anything that you're worried about, try to create it in a list that is can be sort of a checklist, so that you then have some information about what's going on in the classroom. I mean, I can ask for an RBT or an aid, but I need to also be able to demonstrate that the child needs it. I mean, it can't just be like, I want this, I want somebody there to sort of be right next to my child. And the other thing about aids that I caution people on is, and this is not a knock on aids, but in general, they need a GED, right? That's not to say that every one of them only has a GED, but that is the expectation, like you have a GED. So why do I want the least educated person attached at the hip to my child who is perhaps the most neurologically complex? I want a teacher teaching my child, not necessarily an aide who may be very well-intended, very warm and loving, and want my child to succeed, but in the meantime makes my child very prompt dependent and can be a barrier to friendship. When they're younger, they love, like Miss Lisa, they're very happy to engage with your child who has an aide right next to him or her. But in the 4th grade, that's a barrier to friendship. And the aide may be the only one sitting with your child during lunch. So I caution against that. Sometimes it's absolutely necessary, but just like when the doctor gives you a medication, well, what are the side effects? Well, what are the side effects of having an RBT? What are the side effects of having an aide work with your child? Does the teacher then and does the teacher sort of give up ownership because the aide's got it? The aide will be in the back working on that math worksheet, and I'll work with the other kids. It's human nature. It can happen. Not every teacher is going to do this, but I've seen it happen. So you just want to make sure that that's not the case. And if you really need it, absolutely. But if the school isn't raising alarms, then you probably don't have much of an issue, unless something else is going on it's hard for me to say without all of the information. The next, yeah.
One thing.
Yeah.
For example, my son had a lot of sensory integration issues when he was little, and so the aide would take him out to do pull-ups in the cafeteria or to take him to the trampoline, which was sitting right outside the front door of the room. So when they're used for very particular purposes, it can be terrific.
Yeah, exactly. So having that ability to sort of work on a sensory diet, and to my mind, you may not even need to leave the classroom. It could be sort of embedded in. So like if your kid needs to use a trampoline, well, what really they need is sort of heavy work. So you say, here are some textbooks. I want you to move these textbooks. So you'll get the same input. The trampoline gives you input into your joints, and it sort of has that grounding feeling that you're getting. Because a lot of kids with sensory issues don't know where their body is in space. And you may have this kind of kid, if as you're walking, he's like walking right into you, and you're like, please, they're stepping on you. They just don't know where they are in space. So you give them, an experience of jumping on a trampoline, and they get that, it's called proprioceptive input. But you can do that by giving them a heavy backpack or a weighted lap blanket. Those kinds of things can help, just as a way of keeping them in the classroom. All right, the next one, the process for obtaining special education services. It starts with a referral. You can make the referral, or the teacher can make the referral. And the threshold is someone suspects a disability. Doesn't mean there is one, but we suspect something's amiss. That's, that should be the, sort of the rallying cry for maybe we need an evaluation. Now, you would meet with the school and you would have that, initial PPT. And at that initial PPT, the school decides whether or not to evaluate. Okay, they will say, you know what? He's making progress. And in IDEA, in the law, it says you can still have an IEP even if you are making, appropriate progress to, go from grade to grade. It's not like you only have to be left back or in danger of failing everything, that because that's just that narrow view of academics. But if we look at behavior, if we look at social, if we look at the emotional piece, then, it may fall into one of those categories. So that's what would happen next. So they decide whether or not to evaluate. And I will say, I have had people come to me and they've asked me, like very worried, very nervous, oh, I don't think my child's doing well. And I remember one case very clearly. Her son was 5 and she said, he's not tying his shoes. And I said, well, because it's not expected till he's about 7. Like it's just not a milestone that's expected before 7. It's okay, and she had an older son who was reading, and this 5-year-old wasn't yet reading, but the older brother was at that age. And I said, well, that's because, this kid, your first kid, was precocious. I mean, there isn't an expectation that you're reading at 5, sort of coming into kindergarten. Your other son just had a splinter skill, if you will. Like they just were natural readers. And this kid is really fine. So I have had cases where parents come to me very, very upset and concerned, but it really has to be based upon something and not sort of like a nervousness and that they're not top of the class, and that's not a disability to not be top of the class. The parent signs consent to evaluate if the school thinks that this is appropriate. The evaluations are administered, the results are written up in a report, and you can request those 3 days in advance, like I said. They'll have an eligibility meeting, and if the child is eligible, they do not diagnose your child. That is outside of their remit. It is not required in the law for the school district to provide you with a diagnosis. They make your child eligible. They look at a constellation of symptoms and decide, does your child fit into any one of these categories? And in the federal law, it's 13. In Connecticut, it's 15. I think we have 15 categories. They look at all of those categories and see, does your child fit into any of those categories? That's all they're doing. You will never get a diagnosis unless you ask for a neuropsych or a clinical psychology report, but the school doesn't have to provide that for you. If they agree to it, great, and hopefully you'll get that, but there's, again, no guarantee, and it is not required in order to receive special education fund, the special education services. So when you are going to college and the college will say, we want a DSM-5 diagnosis, a report, and we want, all this information, you may not have that from your school record. So you will have to go out and get a neuropsych. There's a law that is hopefully going to pass, federal law. It's called the RISE Act, and they are trying to make it so that you can use your IEP, your 504 plan, any of your school records for the purposes of getting accommodations at college. Hasn't gone through yet, but here's hoping. Yes. Yes, absolutely. Oh, they are sticklers. I am, tearing my hair out, like, saying, you guys, I'm in this program, and I'm like, colleges are using this as a shield, as a sort of gatekeeping. It's like the kid has a disability, it's kind of lifelong. It's not going to change, so why can't we take the information from fourth grade? The RISE Act will correct that. But currently, no. And some colleges have very restrictive policies. Some will say no more than a year old, and some will say no more than 3 years. And that's a significant expense for parents on top of the 60 grand they're already, soaking you for. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. So the biggest thing that you can do is to put it in writing. Put your concerns in writing. If it's not in writing, it didn't happen. That is your biggest strategy, tip, whatever that I think you can do. I will get further into how you can make a better case for this evaluation procedure in the coming slides. But so I'm sorry, the audience member said that a big hurdle is actually getting the school district to agree to evaluate. And how do you overcome that, the resistance to actually evaluate? And we will get to that. But in writing, everything in writing. It's really important because once they have that, you've put them on notice, and that's really important. So just when you have like a trip and fall on a sidewalk, the municipality will say, well, we didn't know that the sidewalk was cracked. But if you say, well, 5 months ago, I put in writing that this sidewalk was cracked and I wanted you to fix it, then they've been on notice and they chose not to do anything about it. That's when you have the issue. So putting somebody on notice, like they can't fix what they don't know what to fix, right? So you've got to give them the opportunity. So if you put them on notice, and you have to say, like, here's why I think my child should be evaluated. And you can say things like, there's a history of dyslexia in my family. There's a history of ADHD. ADHD and dyslexia are very highly heritable. You inherit these. You can talk about the difficulty he has with the homework. And what I would do when my son was in school is I would send a note to the teacher and say, he can't do this homework on his own. I helped him. This is not reflective of his work. Gerri Fleming. Sure, they were thrilled to receive that. But I would say, please review these concepts with him tomorrow because he hasn't internalized them. They are not mastered. So go over it again, because homework in my district anyway was it had to be something that the child ostensibly could do on his or her own. So when my child was struggling and I mean quite literally a 5-minute worksheet was an hour and a half and we were sweating and I mean like if he had just listened to me, I could have taught him the skill in the time that it took for the tantrum to play out. But that's what would happen because he also knew the rules that this is something he was supposed to do on his own. So I would get a lot of pushback there. So that's when you just, and if he can't do it, you just write the note. Couldn't do it. Please, pull him aside tomorrow and work on it, because he won't let me help him, even though teacher. No. Sticky notes can be pulled off. Didn't happen. Put it on there. Or an email, something that can't be thrown away. So you have the eligibility meeting. If eligible, the kid gets, placement in special education, and then an IEP is developed. This is how it is supposed to happen. Rarely happens this way. Placement should be determined after the IEP is written. All the goals, the objectives have been written. The goals and objectives do not get written until we have present levels of performance put down and any concerns or needs. The concerns and the needs are what drive the goals and objectives. We don't work on things that don't need to be worked on. So if I say he should be reading at, X number of words per minute, and he's only reading at, X minus 30 words per minute, that's a problem. So then that is a goal that I want to work on his reading and, reach another 30 words, correct words per minute by the end of the year. That's a goal or an objective. When you come up with a list of concerns, that's what drives the IEP. So you can't write the goals before you've written all of the concerns and issues that you think are important. Do not squander that opportunity. We'll get to that in a bit. And we don't determine the placement until we know what the goals and objectives are and where they should be then worked on, right? We have to consider what's the least restrictive environment. And for some kids, it's definitely not the general ed. I mean, if we've got a kid who is a predator, and I've had, I had kids who were sexual predators. That's not in the general education. That kid needs to be outplaced to a very restrictive placement where those, things can be therapeutically worked on. That's the reality. Like certain challenges that come up in the writing of these goals and objectives, the things that, have to be worked on, they can't be worked on in a gen ed classroom. I would also say, I wouldn't want my kid who is 3 years behind in a reading level to be in the gen ed classroom reading Hop on Pop while everyone else is reading Harry Potter. That isn't dignified. That is taking that child's dignity and eroding it. Everyone else is reading a chapter book and he's reading a picture book. That has to be done outside of the classroom. That's, I know they don't like to be pulled out, but it's worse to be, so embarrassed by that. That's, so it really is, your call, your child, what your child is willing to endure. And the IEP, so parents are asked to sign consent for special education. When you are asked to sign consent for special education that first time, you are not saying, I consent to this IEP. You are just consenting in theory or, on an intellectual level. I agree, my child needs special education. It may not be the special education that you're offering me here, but we both agree, that is something we agree on. You've written the IEP, and I agree that he needs an IEP, but it doesn't mean that you are agreeing to that IEP. So it doesn't end there. But if you do not sign consent, we're done. We're done here. You've got to sign consent for the provision of special instruction before you actually have a funding stream, to fight them. Because before that, you don't even have the funding stream, in your, to help you with this. All Special education defined, it is specially designed instruction at no cost to the parents to meet the unique needs of a child. It can happen in all of these settings: classroom, home, hospitals, institutions, and other settings. I put this in because what I have noticed is a lot of times when you go on homebound instruction, they say it has to be in the library. It has to be at the Board of Ed building. And it doesn't. The law, the federal law says it can happen in the home. And if that's where you think it should happen, it's homebound instruction. If that's where your child is at that moment, really needs to be at home, that's the only place where your child feels safe. I mean, generally we go to homebound for medical reasons, okay? Your child is medically fragile. A lot of these kids are taught at home because, maybe there are immune issues, or maybe, if the child has cancer and, cannot be in and among a classroom of kids. Those kids go on homebound. When Obamacare came into being, there was a piece of that law that said there is parity with mental health. Medical health is the same as mental health. So then homebound, it was much easier to argue for homebound for a kid who is anxious, who's depressed, who's having, some very significant mental health challenges to get to school. I'm not saying that it's necessarily the right thing to do. There are times when you want your kid in school and to have, sort of a more typical experience, but sometimes you've got to meet the kid where the kid is. And if it's a victory just for that kid to get up, take a shower, and put on clothes, then that's a victory, right? They may still be in the house, but, they may just need a lot of time and a lot of support. So when you go to homebound, a lot of times the schools will resist home, but you should know that that's where it is. It's in the IDEA that homebound can be taught in the home. Yeah. Does it include toilet training? If your child needs toilet training, it can be part of your IEP. Absolutely. What schools will resist is anything that's medical. And when you talk about medical is, that which can only be performed by an MD. So what I would say is, I think as a parent, if your child isn't toilet trained, I would be going to a urologist just to see, is there anything going on there? A lot of times kids, a lot of times they will wet the bed because their urine doesn't yet concentrate overnight. I mean, there could be a physical issue as to why, this is happening. It would probably be very difficult to get because it really has to be something that's done in collaboration with the family. Like, you can't just put it off on the school and say, teach my child to do this. But I think that any plan that you and your doctor comes up with, you could say to the school district, you need to work on this. But there has to be, I would think, a medical reason for toilet training. I think they could certainly follow through with the plan, but I don't know that they would create the plan. Do you have any thoughts on that? Yeah. Yeah, teaching a kid to ride a bicycle, yes, they could do that. The toilet training, it's iffy. I think they could follow a plan that I'm sorry, say that again? Oh, you want them to come to your home? Mm-mm. I don't see that happening. Yeah, I could, rather than have this on the tape, I have some thoughts, and it would involve me asking more sensitive and personal questions. So let's defer that till afterwards. A lot of things can be under the purview of what's acceptable. I would, because toilet training is sort of an intimate activity, it may, it involves a good degree of trust. I'll leave it at that. So we'll discuss it afterwards offline. But that is an ADL. It's an activity of daily living. I just, I think that the school would resist. It would be difficult. Yeah. That would be, functional, the functional goals. I think on the new CT SEDS, it's like functional, right? I have to say I'm not all that, well-versed in the new CT SEDS IEP. And I haven't devoted a whole lot of time to it because I know it's going to change. It's just so terrible. It has to change. But I think there is a section on functional skills, and it would go under that. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. You can ask for a reevaluation as often as every year. However, caution you, every time your child is comprehensively evaluated, they can determine eligibility again. So if it's a one-off, if it's like, you know what, I really think speech and language is an issue and we're just going to do a very limited speech and language evaluation, you don't run the risk of losing special ed services. But if you ask for a comprehensive evaluation and they give it to you, and then they say, based on this data, we don't feel your child meets eligibility, you're out of luck. If they have eligibility for 3 years until that triennial. So that's just so you're aware. That is the risk that you take every time your child is comprehensively evaluated. No, you don't. You can request that at any time. It just the physical, the time needs to be at least a year between testing, so that you don't have the the effect of, I've learned the test and I'm going to naturally get a higher score because the test is familiar to me. Because a lot of times they'll get the same version of the test. So, but if it's an area that wasn't tested, like let's just say you did a comprehensive eval, but OT wasn't part of that, then at any time you can ask that of the team. Okay. All right. Let's see. It does talk about under special education that content can be modified. Again, yes, content can be modified, but generally that content for a kid with special ed is lowered. And you just want to make sure that you are not giving up something that is really important for your child to know. Because it can sort of preclude them from getting into a college or from getting a high school diploma rather than a certificate of completion. We've gotten very highly specific on the types of courses kids need to take in order to get a high school diploma in Connecticut. It's getting, stricter and stricter each year. So just make sure that when you make that decision to reduce content, that you are not taking your child out of the running for a high school diploma rather than a certificate of completion. Yeah. Yeah. No. Nope. Got to test. That's the only time that they can, so a lot of times they'll say, I mean, I've had this happen. He has no more goals and objectives. He mastered them all. We're done. It doesn't work that way, because next year there will be other things for him to learn, and we need to do that. So they may only remove a service unless they've tested and determined that this is no longer needed. So, like, let's just say they remove speech. They keep the IEP, but they remove speech without testing. That they're not supposed to do that. That is not allowed. Yeah, Cheryl. Yeah. See, I would argue as the advocate, no, he didn't master the objectives. You were the ones who picked this. What went on that he isn't mastering them, and maybe just say, then it's a comp ed thing. You owe me compensatory education. You agreed to do this, and you didn't follow through. Whether that gets you anywhere is another story, but yeah. Or they routinely master them, and to what end? They haven't mastered the material, they've mastered the goal. And just be careful when you read goals and objectives. Like I read an IEP recently, and it was like, with 2 prompts, he will be able to do this. Well, you could prompt me in physics or whatever, and with 2 prompts, I'd get it right too. Like, it's, if you're prompting somebody, then it's not mastery. So you just want to make sure that you read them, and the other thing, like, a lot of times they'll say, he's able to do it 4 out of 5 times in a year. Okay, like 4 out of 5 times in a year, and how many times are, like, we can all sort of, win the lottery, or what, like, it needs to be like, 4 out of 5 times, or I would put in things like, 4 out of 5 consecutive times, and if mastered prior to the end of the IEP, we will do monthly probes to check for maintenance of the skill. But 4 out of 5 times in a year over 180 days, I mean, that's just happenstance. That's random. He got 4 out of the 5 right. And then when you see like 4 out of the 5 right at 80% of the time, 4 out of 5 right is already 80%. Then at 80% of the time, 64%. The 80 times 8, 80 times 80, we're at 64% of the time. That's not mastery of anything. To be able to do something 2 out of the 3 times. Like, we mean mastery of a grade level skill. The other reason why this definition is important is because it says methodology. A lot of times they don't want to talk about methodology like it's their purview, but when you went for Lucy Calkins, I get to talk to you about methodology. Just saying. Sorry, that was pretty sarcastic, but too many of our kids aren't reading. Informed consent. You only sign consent 3 times. 3 times. So just be aware. What informed consent means is that you have been fully informed of all the information relevant to the activity for which the consent is sought. So you know everything, that you are able to make a reasonable decision about whatever it is they are asking you to consent to. And this is really big when it comes to testing. You may revoke your consent at any time as well. It is voluntary. You may not, the school cannot use your refusal to consent to one thing to deny you another activity. So let's just say you've got an evaluation and the school wants to do projectives. I never let them do projectives because there's not a lot of validity on a projective. So projectives are like the Rorschach tests. You know, what do you see in this ink blot? And, you know, I see a bat, you know, like that kind of a bat, you know, I see a bat or I see a monster. And then, you know, the person creates a narrative. This is when you get analysis, when it's dubious at best. You know, I think that the child is frightened at home. You know, the child is feeling unsafe. Like they can put whatever they want. And there's really no way of testing it, right? I mean, I once saw one where a kid had, there's another one, house person tree, and the kid drew the person and they put circles for the eyes and didn't like color in the circles. And they said there were no pupils drawn in the eyes, suggesting vacancy. And I was just like, oh my goodness, that's a big leap. You know, the child drew a house and it didn't have a horizon line, suggesting that he feels untethered from this world and, you know, doesn't want to be a part of society. And I was like, you know, this is ridiculous. Like, I'm terrible at drawing. You can't possibly, you know, come up with these leaps of you know, conclusions that are negative, you know, against the child. So just don't agree to projectives. And you are allowed to say, I don't think my kid needs them. What are we going to use on the IEP? You know, are projectives part of the, you know, curriculum? I mean, what purpose do they serve other than to, you know, have a case against you as a parent? So you are allowed to say no to certain tests that you don't want. And because, you know, there may be implications of having those tests on the record. And you are only asked for your written consent with the initial evaluation, with the agreement for special ed if the child is found eligible, and every 3 years thereafter, or if you choose to do it at shorter intervals, anytime the school is testing. Now, I think that the school doesn't give us enough information on the testing, and we'll talk about that. The other piece of consent, and it is not written consent, but it is consent. In Connecticut, when the school wants to place your child at an outside placement, they need your consent. They can't just place your kid there without your consent. So that is from the Connecticut General Statutes. And it's kind of wordy. To meet its affirmative obligation under the law, you know, any local or regional board of education may make agreements with another such board, or subject to the consent of the parent or guardian of any child affected thereby, make agreements on or after July 1st. I mean, this is one sentence. I mean, if I were, you know, marking that for an essay as a high school teacher, I'd be like, run on. That is a run-on sentence, and I can barely parse it. Essentially, they need your consent if they're going to place your child somewhere. So, and it is supposed to be a decision where parents are part of the decision-making body that determines placement for the child. And that's even in the federal regs, but it doesn't go as far as saying, the federal regulations say they are part of the team that places the child, but this says parental consent is required. Okay, so that goes just a little bit further. You don't sign an IEP in Connecticut. In other states, you do. So just because a lot of times parents come and they tell me like, well, I didn't sign it. And it's like, well, nobody does. Nobody signs an IEP. The way you let your objection be known is that you write something within 5 days of receiving that IEP, and you say, I'm in disagreement with this. And that puts them on notice, and they should say, then let's have another PPT meeting and we can collaborate and make it better. And if that doesn't happen, I would, perhaps if you want to escalate it, you might want to get an advocate or an attorney to keep working on this. Because, you don't think it's going to give your child an appropriate education based on the way it's written. If you want the IEP not to be implemented as it's written, then you have to file for due process. That is the only way to stop an IEP from being implemented. And then what happens is that action of you filing for due process invokes the stay put provision, which means the IEP, the last agreed upon IEP that was written, that's the IEP that is then implemented. So it may be for all goals and objectives that your child knows or has mastered, but the placement, a lot of times parents do this to keep the child in the placement that they prefer. Okay, that's why you would do, that's when you would invoke a stay put. But when you just disagree with the IEP and you're willing to work with them on it, then you just write your amendment letter. I call it an amendment letter, where I'm saying, like, this is what I don't agree with, what you've written. And I say, something like, it's prompted, it's heavily prompted. Goal number 1, objectives 1, 2, and 3 all have prompts. So we're not actually testing or measuring his progress, because, virtually anything can be done if it's prompted. Sounds like, or, you're helping him, write it or whatever. I mean, that's a prompt. Next one, tips and strategies. Get it in writing, put it in writing. That is so important. A lot of times we get phone calls from the school, and, I'm like, elbow deep in chicken juice, and I get a phone call from the school as I'm trying to make dinner. And it's like, I just want to tell you something that happened on the playground today. And, we have a conversation or whatever. Get it in writing. The teacher isn't going to put it in writing, or whoever called you. You just say, Dear Mrs. So-and-so, thank you for the impromptu phone call where we discussed the incident on the playground. When I asked my child about it, this is what he tells me. So it wasn't that he was bullying Mary, but Mary was bullying him. Whatever it is, you want to correct the record in writing. It wasn't given to you in writing, but you correct it in writing, especially if somebody agrees to do something. You have the impromptu meeting, it's, field day, and the teacher agrees, oh, yeah, I'll do that on Monday. You're talking to her and you say, hey, can you do X? And she agrees to it. Well, then put it in writing. Dear Mrs. So-and-so, it was lovely to see you at field day. Just as a big thank you. I just want to, let you know how much I appreciate you, especially that you agreed to do X. Get it in writing, okay? The next thing, before the IEP, you want to request in writing to receive the documents. So I always ask for it in advance of the IEP meeting. So I want it in enough time that I have the opportunity to review it. And I ask for the draft IEP any, and it may not be written, so that you may not get it, but I ask if one has been written, I want it. I want any data, any progress monitoring, benchmark testing. Benchmark testing refers to the testing that schools do to make sure your child is on grade level. They do it 3 times a year from K to 3 generally. Some schools do it K to 5, but it is in reading, it is in writing, and it is in math 3 times a year. A lot of times you don't get that. Some school districts are very good about giving that to you, but other school districts, you know, parents, I ask for it and they don't know what I'm talking about. But benchmark testing, get that in advance so that you know. And you'll be able to say, well, you know, he's not reading on grade level based on your own testing. So we've got to beef up the IEP. So you'll have that information. I want work samples. I want to know how my kid's doing. Show me some of the work samples. If the kids use computer-based learning systems like IXL and you know, read write or any of those programs, ask for computerized printouts of what he has done or she has done, because a lot of times it'll say, you know, he's completed 10% of this, and it's like we're half the year done, and he should have done, you know, 50% because we're half the year done or whatever. So that's helpful to have that. I already talked about what to do with the IEP. If you are asking about ESY, they agree to ESY and they tell you about ESY or any program that they're offering, get it in writing. There should be a write-up. A lot of times what I find is that they won't write up a program because it's fluid as to who it will serve or what it will do. Well, I want a promise of a program, because if you're going to do whatever, you know, based on who's there, then maybe it's not a therapeutic program, or maybe it's not the ESY program that I want for my kid, right? So I want to know what ESY should entail, and they should be able to give you that information in writing so that you know, is this an appropriate ESY? If your child is eligible for ESY, just as your child is eligible for special education during the year, if the program that they're offering isn't appropriate, then you get to choose something else.
Just to make sure everyone knows, extended school year.
Oh, ESY is extended school year, thank you. And extended school year, you should know, and this I think is the most ridiculous thing, but extended school year is to prevent regression. So what they will do is they will work on the same goals and objectives that they have worked on all year. They won't use this opportunity, this amazing opportunity to have 6 weeks to actually pre-teach or catch a child up or anything like that. No, wherever he was on June whatever, that's where he will remain until September. I think the best way to prevent regression is to keep moving in the curriculum, right? And if we gain extra, yay, but that's not the way it works. So you should be aware of that, you know, you can say you want your child to gain momentum. That is not a requirement under the law. And maybe that's something that, you know, parents need to lobby Congress for, and certainly the state legislative body as well. Yes. Right. Okay, so this is right. So the question is, you know, you're at the PPT, you find that the offer of ESY is incredibly minimal. It's, you know, 1 or 2 days a week for an hour and a half a session. I would, you know, it really depends on how robust the IEP is during the year. And what I would say is you have to use where your child is in the curriculum. And so if my child is so far behind, I would use that and say, you know, we could use this for compensatory education. You can't use it for ESY, but you could use it for compensatory education to say this is the opportunity for our kids to catch up. Yes, Cheryl. Yes. That is true. Yeah. So there is a topic brief, an ESY, Extended School Year topic brief from the State Department of Ed. And if you just go on to the State Department of Ed website and type in the search box topic brief ESY, it will come up. And basically, ESY isn't just, you don't get ESY just for purposes of regression. What I'm saying is, in ESY, they don't have to go beyond just regression, but they can, especially if you are given the opportunity to attend ESY for other reasons. And when you read the other reasons, because it's based on a court case called Royce v. Fountain, and so you can get ESY, Extended School Year services, to prevent regression, but also if you have any interfering behaviors during the year that prevented you from learning, if you have a need for sameness and predictability, that sounds like autism, because if you are a kid with autism and you get used to staying home, it's very hard to get back into that groove and go back to school. So having the opportunity to go to ESY sort of keeps them on the schedule of going to school. Like, that's very important. And then emerging skills. If you have an emerging skill, we certainly don't want to have that go away. So yes, you can get ESY to sort of keep going on that particular skill. So always say, emerging skill, emerging skill. And the other thing is the opportunity for something that can only occur in the summer. So let's just say you've got a child on the autism spectrum and he needs swim safety, right? And to know how to be safe in the water, because a lot of times kids on the autism spectrum they gravitate towards water, and too many of them drown. So you can say during the summer, there are pools available and I can get, Aileen Tisser of Angelfish Therapy to work with him on, pool safety or whatever, water safety skills, because the school may not be able to do it, but you have somebody on the outside who can. And you would say, can I also get this for ESY on top of the other thing, because he is, in danger of, doing, he's attracted to water and yet not safe around water. So those kinds of things you can ask for, because that, the ability to swim, some schools do not have any indoor pools. Some do, but many don't. So the ability to get that only occurs during the summer.
Gerri.
Yeah. Oh, is it? Oh my God, I didn't even get to everything. Can I just go through this really quickly to see? Informed consent, more on consent in Connecticut.
Goes, a lot of times the physical therapist who works in the school or the occupational therapist will do private lessons. At least that's what happened here. When my kid was little during the summer, the occupational therapist taught him how to ride his bike, taught him how to swim, both of the kids actually. And you can often find somebody who's part of the school district, so they know the kid already, to be able to do some things like that over the summer. I think the swimming was, we did pay for. The bicycle riding was part of it.
If you could make it, an argument that it is an ADL or an activity of daily living, or it is a leisure skill that my child needs, or something along those lines, you can get the school to pay for it. But a lot of times, if it's something like an OT or a PT, your home and your personal family insurance will often cover it. We went to Aileen Tisser, and her swim therapy, she's a PT, she would give me a bill as PT, so it was aqua therapy, and I could submit it to my insurance. I just want to say this is the form that you get to when it is time for testing, and the school has to fill this out about the tests that they are proposing for a triennial. And a lot of times what I see under that part that I have highlighted in yellow, it says test evaluation or procedure, and they write individually administered. Well, that's not what a test or evaluation is. What I expect there is to see Wyatt, Towel, QRI, all of the alphabet soup of test names. And then it's the evaluation, the assessment area, so it'll be reading, or it'll be achievement, or speech and language, and then the evaluator would be the speech and language pathologist, the special education teacher, the psychologist, etc. That's the way that should be filled out. And I would be very specific with them and say, I need this information. I need to know what testing you're doing prior to this, so that I have a sense of what you are actually asking of my child. So I want to know, like, what's the test, how long it will take, etc. Because under informed consent, you need to have all the information, at your fingertips so you can consent to it, right? You can't, like, when your doctor says, I'm going to send you for a test, he or she doesn't say, I'm just going to send you for a test. They say, I'm going to send you for an MRI. You're going to go for a PET scan. And then they're going to tell you about what the PET scan involves or whatever. So you need to know what information, the information required so that you can truly have informed consent when you sign this. Yeah. No, you don't get open. First of all, they always say this. They always say, we're keeping it open. This makes me so angry that we're keeping it open. And I say, I'm here every day. And you know what? There's this amazing tool called email, and there's a telephone. And if you want to add something to it, you can write that down and send that to me, and I will sign another consent form. But you need to give me an idea of what you are going to test him in. No, you still need to have the form. They do that when they write individually administered. So if they haven't written individually administered, if you haven't signed something that says individually administered, that's when they think, like, well, we've got this broad agreement on what we can and cannot do with this child. So I say, I need to know. I really need to know, because then I do my homework and I see the Wyatt has 21 subtests and you chose to do 4. Well, who said you could do 4? It doesn't say selected subtests of the Wyatt. It says the Wyatt. So I'm expecting all 21, and you chose not to do, you chose, 4 that he's going to ace, right? So I would be able to go online, look and see how many subtests there are on that test, and then why didn't you do them all? Who told you you could do that? You're not a clinician, you're a special ed teacher. You don't have the expertise to determine what tests should and shouldn't be given. And when they do that, a lot of times you can't get the core scores, like the comprehensive, the index scores or the overall like reading level or whatever. So when they do that, you're lost. So they have to administer the test. There's actually a box there. If you'll see, it says no adaptations, accommodations required, or adaptations or accommodations required. When they don't check that, they have no adaptations and then they adapt. They give the test over 15 days instead of giving it in one setting, which is what the school, what the standardized protocol says. Then they violated the standardization and the scores don't count. They have to do it the way it was intended. And so sometimes I had one case where the school district gave the kid the Wyatt over 15 days, one subtest a day, or two, one or two, but it's supposed to be done in one day because you want to have the fatigue built in, and it has to be given in a certain order. The last thing that you give the kid is writing to see how they do in a fatigued situation. And if you give it each test when he's fresh as a daisy, well, he's going to ace it. And they used that. The client came to me afterwards. They used that to exit him from special education. They said, look, he aced every one of the achievement tests. Now, that's not enough to get you exited from special education, but certainly when you violate the protocol, then those standardized scores are nonsense because it wasn't administered in a standardized way. Yeah. No, so it should, if they don't have to give any accommodations or adaptations, then it should be no accommodations, no adaptations. But if they have to, like let's just say when it was during COVID, they should have checked, yes, we have to give masks. So, that would be checked, yes, the accommodation or the modification, the adaptation was that we were both masked and you're gonna miss some things. Or we were wearing the plastic masks, but there could be glare on that. It's not the same. Yes. Yeah. 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 I've never seen that checked. Never. So I would assume it happened during COVID, but I've never seen it. Let me just see if there's anything. Oh, so I'll do the next. The next slide is important too, really quick. When you have an IEP meeting, you want to have your input, your say. And I hate the new IEP because it doesn't give the categories. So I'm just giving you a bunch of categories to consider. If you have concerns in reading, write up a category, reading. Write up math, write up computer skills or digital literacy, other subject areas like science or math or art, if he's having trouble in any of those. Executive functioning, fine motor skills, gross motor skills, all of these things are things that you can put down and list your concerns. Because you don't have that, the way the old IEP, you would look at pages 4 and 5 and you'd see the areas of, the different areas that had to be considered. They don't put it down now. So I've just put this here and Eve tells me that this will be up on the website, the SPED NET website, so you can refer to it. It's already there. And then how do you know if it's really an issue, like that woman who came to me with her 5-year-old who couldn't tie his shoes? You look for milestones. The CDC publishes milestones. what the physical expectations are, the communication expectations are. ASHA, the American Speech and Hearing Association, also prints out milestones. So if your child is 4 and he's not, stringing 2 words together, like, want milk, and just saying milk, well, that's a little late to not be stringing words together so that you would have an understanding of it. So you want to do that. You'd want to look at the benchmark results that you will receive because you ask for them, and look at the report card. If the report card says, like if you get a 1 to a 4 rating and your child has a 2 on something, and it says, whatever the skill is, well, then that should be a concern that you put on your IEP. And the other thing that you can look at is the Common Core state standards to see, because they give them by year. So if your child, so they'll put down the 5th grade skills. You look, if he's in 5th grade and you look at 5th grade, well, he's going to be learning those this year. So you wouldn't put that necessarily on an IEP, but you would look at the 4th grade, and anything that he doesn't have from 4th grade, I would say that's fair game. If it says that there should be noun-verb agreement in his writing and he's, still writing, in a way that it's not agreeing, or, pronoun usage or whatever, I would then put that on as a parental concern. And let's see. And certainly whatever you know about your child. And then what I did was I gave an idea of like some of the things. So executive function issues, and it's time management, it's organization, it's study skills, note-taking, that kind of thing. Then I have reading. This is what, when I write up these things, this is kind of what it looks like. And writing concerns. And again, this is all up on the website. And the letter to Northrop says, a lot of times schools will say, well, we didn't know you had all these concerns. And usually what I say is, well, I gleaned these from, this is a distillation of what I saw in the, the record. So, you should know these. None of this is new to you. But also the letter to Northrop, the OSEP is Office of Special Education Programming. They say school districts cannot say we're not going to discuss this at the meeting because you didn't send it to us in advance. They have to discuss it at the meeting. And let's see. FERPA records. FERPA is the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. Just as you have HIPAA records, that's your medical records, Health Insurance Privacy and Portability Act. FERPA governs your education records. You can ask for them. They are required to give you a copy, one copy. So you can't keep asking for the same records over and over again without having to pay for them, but you are entitled to one printed copy. So ask for them. I usually say ask at the end of the year to get all of the work samples, because an education record is that which pertains to the child and is maintained by the district. So if the district throws it out, it's no longer maintained. It's not an education record. They are not required to keep work samples. They are required to keep, the benchmark testing, certain things they have to keep longer, but your child's work records go away. There's some tips on emails. Let's see. Oh, and you should know what a related service is, and parent counseling and training is on that. So if you want parent counseling and training, you should ask for it. One year I actually had a case where none of the school team had ever worked with a kid on the autism spectrum before. And to the school's credit, I asked them to send the team to Yale. Yale was doing a 2-day autism conference. And they sent every team member to this conference for 2 days. So, ask the teacher, is there any training you want to get? She can't ask or he can't ask, but you can, as the parent. You can say, I want this. Will you do it? They'll say yes or no, and why. Go ahead. Yes. Yeah, that's part C of IDEA, but it's 3 through 21. Ages 3 through 21.
And we've actually had that done here for my son when we had a consultant, a behaviorist consultant, when he was in preschool services. She came in and she trained the whole staff, because it was long, long ago when people didn't know much about teaching kids on the spectrum. I'm saying this was 26 years ago, so back then they knew really nothing. We also had it done in the high school with a speech and language pathologist.
And if you have a young team, maybe, you have a team where they're all new teachers, and, if you can give them a leg up by letting them go to a workshop, if you ask for it, it holds a lot more weight than if the teacher were to request it. So, yep. Any other questions?